there, extra historians. Welcome to Lies, the part of the show where we tell you all the things we left out, all the stuff we got wrong, and all the icebox we doppelbocked. I'm Rob Rath. I'm the head writer of Extra History, and this is the history of beer, which everyone seemed to really enjoy. I loved doing this series, but the last take went 40 minutes, so let's get to it real fast. Lies is made possible by Patreon and our wonderful patrons. Thank you. This is a really integral part of the show. Recommended reading for this week is The United States of Beer by Dane Huckelbridge. This is not just a good book about American beer. Its first chapter is just a really great crash course in the history of beer. History of the World in Six Glasses by Tom Standage. There's one chapter that deals with beer, and it's mostly the initial invention of beer. So it was important to our first episode, but not so much after that. Drink, A Cultural History of Alcohol by Iain Gately. I liked this book a lot. It's not solely about beer, so if you just want a general history of alcohol, this is a pretty good thing to pick up. But if you're just interested in beer, you're gonna have to pick through like whiskey and gin and like all that kind of stuff. But so that's all very interesting. Drunk, How We Sipped, Danced, and Stumbled Our Way to Civilization by Edward Slingerland. This I mostly like kind of cross-referenced with other stuff, especially about intoxication. Curiosity Stream and Nebula. We are partners with Curiosity Stream, which have a lot of cool nonfiction documentaries, including one, The Story of German Beer, which is about the history and practice of German beer making, and Beer, A Love Story, which is more about modern microbreweries. They pair nicely with the series. So why do a series about beer? I love the history of commodities. The other ones on the vote were early electricity, chocolate, and rum, which are all things that I would love to do, particularly chocolate. I think that would make a really good series. But I feel like it collapses the distance between past and present when it's something that is just very familiar to us and is very everyday. And I also just like stuff in the present when I know this has this deep and long history to it, where I pick up like a Carlsberg and I know, oh, like this is how this came about. But I mostly wanted to talk about like the social history of beer. So how we changed beer, how beer changed us, how it affected history. I wasn't so much interested in talking about brewing, top fermenting yeast versus bottom fermenting yeast. I feel like there are a lot of really good brewing channels on YouTube that could do that better than us. And I just wanted to focus it on like the people and how people affected beer. We had a few comments about like, what about the social costs of drinking and alcoholism? I didn't really want to get into that in a series that's specifically about beer, because I don't think that's necessarily only a beer problem. I do want to talk about that a lot. If we ever do a Prohibition series, I'd even be interested in doing like kind of a history of drunkenness. That appeals to me. But if we do a Prohibition series, we'll talk about this later, I would definitely go into that. But there is a lot to say. The biggest thing that we left out probably is Belgium. We had a lot of comments about this. I have a little bit of Belgian representation on this table. Belgium is one of those things that like I wanted to put it in episode 3. I ended up having to kick it down the road because I just didn't have time for it. And then it just ended up not in the series at all, which is a big blind spot. Belgium is a really fascinating brewing culture, but it doesn't become a part of the kind of global brewing story until after our series ends. If we did an episode 6, it would definitely be in there. But what's interesting about Belgium is it has this very unique brewing culture. There are 1,500 different types of beer that are produced in Belgium. Many types of beer have a special glass that you drink it in. Beer is used in cooking a lot. And it's actually to the point where UNESCO has declared Belgian beer culture a part of intangible world heritage. So it's a cool thing to talk about. I should have talked about Trappist monks. If I could go back and do it again, I would do that. I would talk about the Trappists and brewing. But it only really becomes big and commercial in the 1880s. And it starts to become really prominent after World War II because, you know, Europe is having a lot of problems with commodities and rationing. And so the beer quality kind of goes downhill. And because of Prohibition, beer quality in the US had kind of gone downhill because you have these macro breweries who are like, well, if we can produce this cheaper and sell it, then like that's what we need to do to like have a healthy business. And you'd start seeing a recovery like later on in the 60s and 70s. Yeah, I'm sorry, Belgium. I like your beer. I like sour beer. I especially like Belgian sour beer. I just want to point out like kind of my own relationship with beer. I drink beer, not a ton. I probably will not drink most of what's these visual aids. I will drink this Polliner because I tend to like kind of dark, sweet beers. I'm not a huge beer drinker, but I think it's really fascinating. And in traveling, I've come across a lot of really cool different beer cultures, from Hanoi, where you're just sitting around on like plastic stools and, you know, getting your 50-cent beer out of an igloo cooler that's being, you know, poured in a Dixie cup and over a big chunky ice cube, versus I went to Munich at one point at Christmas and did some of the brewery tours, and like, you know, this is my Oktoberfest glass that I actually got at Christmas. But my favorite experience was this place called the Buddha Inn in Lukla, Nepal, which is the town you fly into to trek in the Everest region. And we were there on Diwali, the Nepali New Year. And it's this tiny room right next to the airstrip where everyone is flying in and out. There are like rescue helicopters going above, like even in the middle of the night. And it's like an adventurer's tavern from D&D. So like everyone who's there has just come back from a big adventure. The walls are like covered in national flags and like Explorers Club flags, where like people have signed them, like every member of the expedition, and they've like staple gunned it up. It's just a really, really neat scene. And then everyone started dancing, and the floor was going like this because, you know, it's Nepal, so the construction, you know, is a little bit marginal. It was awesome. YouTube question: a series on the history of premiering during Lent. Considering how each series is chosen, I'm confident it's a coincidence, but the comedic timing is impeccable. Yeah, the last episode went live right before Easter, and I'm taping this the day after Easter Monday. And this is pretty fitting since Lent is the season where you would have a fasting period where monks would drink beer because they could still imbibe liquid, and that was a way of getting nutrition. Episode 1. Someone said it's not possible to make beer at 30%. We had this visual that had various bar graphs with percentages above it. I didn't think people were going to take it super literally, to be honest, but we will talk about it. It is possible to brew beer at a higher strength. Not generally. It only happened in 2020, but we'll get to that. But I mostly thought of this as an abstraction. So yes, the absolute top generally is like around like 15%. But what the commenter said, if you distill it to get higher than that, you need to distill it. We'll talk about that. Someone said wort in the context of brewing is pronounced wort, not wart, like the plants. Thank you. A lot of folks took issue with us mentioning the theory that people are drinking beer in the Bible rather than wine. I didn't mean like every time wine is mentioned. Like I don't think like beer is served at the Last Supper. That doesn't really make sense, right? Because the symbolism of wine with blood, right? A lot of this depends on how literally you take the Bible as like true history, which I tend to not very much, but there are people who do, and I wasn't suggesting that everything is wine. I do think it's interesting that the Bible is written by, you know, scribes and people who can write, who are generally elites, who would be more likely to drink wine. So maybe that's why it's mentioned more often. But I just think it's interesting that like beer is around. You know, when we imagine that time, a lot of people are drinking beer. Someone said, alcohol does not kill the bacteria in beer. This is an old wives' tale. In order to make beer, you have to cook the wort. It's the heat from the cooking that kills the bacteria. This is true, but from what I understand, it's the cooking the wort that kills the bacteria, but especially at higher alcohol strengths like 3%, but even for 1%, it's a growth inhibitor. So you kill all the bacteria, and then the alcohol helps it not grow back as quickly as it might have. There are also things in gruit, the spice mixtures, and hops that are antibacterial that help with that. So it's a two-step process. It's like you kill all the bacteria, and then you inhibit the growth of bacteria. Episode 2, patron question from Drunk Captain Crunch. Good name. We mentioned how Romans are considered wine to be a part of Roman culture. Did anything similar to this happen around 18th, 19th century with the rise of nationalism? If so, how? I feel like later episodes got into this, but yes, you know, German beer becomes a big thing. We'll talk about that in German beer purity law later. But it's not just like a nationalist thing, it's a regional thing, right? So you can't call, something champagne unless it's from the Champagne region of France, right? You can't call something Scotch unless it's from Scotland. This is actually enshrined in law in a lot of the EU. But yeah, you just think about it as like regional. It's not necessarily German beer, it's Bavarian style beer, right? And even today, a lot of people talked about Yingling, which is a drink from the northeastern US that is mostly on the East Coast. I think it's moving west a little bit now. But people are really big on their local breweries, especially these days. My wife is from Delaware, so she has to have her Dogfish Head. If she's going to have a beer when she goes home, it has to be Dogfish Head. I'm from Hawaii, and if I get homesick, we'll go find a longboard lager. So it's nationalist, yes, but it's also regionalist. YouTube question, I would like to point out that hops became the dominant additive, more due to taxes on gruit, the herb mixture used for flavoring. We talked about this, yes, in the next episode, but yeah, the taxes also privileged the monasteries, because the monasteries didn't always have to pay the taxes on gruit, right? So if you're competing with a monastically produced beer, then you are having to pay taxes that maybe the monastery isn't, and that's one of the reasons it becomes a thing for Protestants to use hops, because you sort of are like, wow, we're evening the playing field with Catholic monasteries now. A lot of people wanted to see an episode on mead halls. I would love to do one. We might do that in the future. It's very cool, though. There are like special rules for women as cupbearers, and we're talking about serious ceremonial roles. Not just bringing people mead. It's like I'm presenting this mead to you in an official capacity as like the wife of the owner of this mead hall. A lot of people want to see a life story of Hildegard von Bingen. I really want to do one. There's a special thing I want to do for it, if we can. So it might take a little while, but trust me, I am very keen. Episode 3. What were the spices medieval monks added to their ales? Varied a lot from place to place. So heather, ivy, mugwort, yarrow, juniper berries, ginger, nutmeg, cinnamon, mint, which, some of these are imported from different areas of the world. There are a few specialty beers that still do this. And like, yeah, I think this is very cool. And some of them had medicinal uses. We had a commenter that I love. I love it when people kind of expand something that we had to contract, and now I get to talk about it. That the Prophet Muhammad did not prohibit alcohol because of a few incidents. Rather, Muslims believe that alcohol was banned in 3 phases as religious doctrine. Phase 1, I recommend you don't drink because it's bad for your health. Phase 2, don't be drunk around prayer times. And Phase 3, stop drinking entirely. Yeah, this is what I was describing by the incidents, as in it was a gradual tightening of like, okay, well, we're going to try this. Okay, that's clearly not really working. We're going to try something narrower. Or we're going to try something really specific, which is a full ban. From what I read, there was kind of an argument that got a little bit out of hand that alcohol played in. That was like the final straw of like, yeah, no, we can't. This is unmanageable to do this in moderation. Someone wanted to know about Weihenstephaner. I'm very sorry about the pronunciation. This is referring to the Bavarian state brewery of Weihenstephaner, which claims to be the oldest brewery in the world. It's founded in either 1040 or 1146, depending on the document belief. These documents are actually disputed. I'm not really going to offer an opinion on them. Maybe we should have put it in, but that would also have been had to like kind of thrown in like on one side or the other of this. I just want to talk about the idea that medieval peasants had a lot of free time has been disputed. It's been challenged quite a bit. Farm work is very time intensive, and like you're doing your work for your Lord, but you're also like having to cook dinner, which takes hours, right? Meal preparation takes hours. You have to make everything yourself. You can't like knock down to Safeway and like get a loaf of bread. Like you have to grind it. You have to, really specifically knead it. Like you don't have any of these industrial kitchen implements to do this kind of stuff that we have today. It's all done by hand. It's very difficult. But I still find it really super interesting that you start getting these complaints about drunkenness, economically, especially when you start moving into more of like a commercial environment with like contracts and specialization of labor and things like that. Episode 4, I just want to say I love William Hogarth. I'm so happy we got to do Gin Lane and Beer Street. I have a couple of Hogarth prints. They're not expensive if you want to get one. You can get one for like 10, 20 bucks. And we mentioned him in Mary Toft as well. He's just a really fun chronicler of London street life in the Georgian era, which is like my favorite time and place. And his paintings, but really particularly the engravings made of his paintings, are really funny. They have this very cartoony caricature aspect to them. I particularly like The Enraged Musician, which is this, it's kind of dealing with like the terrible noise of London street life, where there's this guy playing a violin who's looking out his window with his hands like against his head, and just everyone outside is making every noise imaginable. It's a hilarious piece of art. Someone asked about IPA beers having much higher alcohol content compared to commercial beers, and he's noticed that many South and Southeast Asian countries have a custom of drinking beer with ice in it from a time when refrigeration wasn't available. Could it be possible that this is how IPAs were meant to be enjoyed, i.e. that the ice waters them down? I don't think so. A lot of British beer is served at cellar temperature, so actually a little bit less cold than Americans tend to drink them. Or we are used to them in the modern day with like throwing a beer in the refrigerator and then pulling it out. So a lot of it's kind of like just below room temperature. That's probably how it was served, I would say. But, you know, room temperature for Europe is also lower than like if you're in Texas, right? To me, it's an adaptation. You know, it's a way to drink cold stuff in a hot climate. But yeah, that gave me a really nice sense memory of Hanoi. You know, when you talked about drinking beer over chunks of ice. Someone mentioned that a Doppelbock is different than an Eisbock. This is the beer that they put a Doppelbock out and make it intentionally freeze, and then they break off the water ice to concentrate it and concentrate it and concentrate it. I assume that Eisbock is a kind of Doppelbock because it's made from Doppelbock. I could be completely wrong in that, so I apologize. And he also mentions that pale lagers were only possible to be made in Munich because of the invention of industrial water softening. Pilsen has soft water, and as a result, they were able to make lagers, or pale lagers. I do just want to say that in 2020, a Scottish and German brewery teamed up to make the most alcoholic beer ever made, and it was a traditionally made Eisbock. They were competing a little bit, but it was a 57.8% ABV Eisbock. A standard Pilsner like a Budweiser or a Carlsberg is 5%, so that's almost 6 times as much alcohol. It's in the whiskey range. Someone mentioned the song Charlie Mops, the Man Who Invented Beer, which I was not familiar with because I had not played A Bard's Tale. Thank you for telling me about that. Now I'm going to have that in my head until I die. It's going right now. Was John Hancock a smuggler? Maybe. I don't want to get too into this because it will just... It's such a big thing, but Hancock was accused of smuggling, accused of unloading one of his ships that was seized at night, taking 75% of the Madeira wine off of it, so that only 25% of it was charged duties. Whether he was a smuggler or a legitimate merchant who engaged in some smuggling partially as like a patriotic gesture to avoid the Townshend Acts, the duties that were being charged on American colonists, or if he was like a 90% legit merchant who occasionally engaged in a little bit of smuggling, is like an ongoing debate, or a totally legit merchant. There are people who say that like the stories about smuggling all come from this court case of which he was dismissed of all charges, and he was basically being targeted because of his agitation toward revolution. So it's an open question whether he was a smuggler or not. There was a lot of smuggling in colonial America, and in colonial anywhere, actually, in the New World. There's a lot in colonial Canada. There's a lot in the Caribbean, which we talk about in our Haitian Revolution series. It's a ton of smuggling. There was some debate in the comments about whether or not we put the proper flag for what's now the Czech Republic. Some people said it was a mistake that we put the Polish flag. Others said that at the time Bohemia used the same flag Poland does now, and that it was used as the flag of Czechoslovakia for 2 years after World War II. So, yeah, flags kind of get reused. This was muddied by the fact that I wanted to put a modern Pilsner Urquell bottle in there just as a visual aid, but I think that kind of muddied what time period we were talking about. Let's talk about the negative effects of the German purity law, the Reinheitsgebot. I alluded to this earlier, but as Germany unifies, Bavaria actually, so like this beer purity law is mostly a Bavarian thing. And Bavaria, which is pretty powerful, starts pushing the beer purity law on other German states as something that they need to adopt for Bavaria to join in German unification. And it's sort of like, it's sometimes talked about as like an internal colonialism of like Bavarianizing the rest of Germany. There was this whole other brewing culture in Germany, in northern Germany in particular, that was more English-style ales. They used a lot of gruit. They didn't use hops. And they end up taking on the Reinheitsgebot, and like within a couple of decades, this whole area of brewing is dead. Like nobody is making it anymore, which is quite sad actually. And if you watch particularly documentaries and things that talk to Bavarian brewers, you always hear like the stuff of, this was such a great thing because there were all these additives and like some of them were poisonous. It's like, yeah, but also some of them were not, and they were just a totally legit style of making beer that had like honey in it or whatever, and it just like it was all wiped out by the expansion of this purity law, and it's really quite a sad story. Anyway, there were some carve-outs for like Hefeweizen, which was considered like a legitimate version of brewing, but this is part of what goes towards making what is quote-unquote German beer, is kind of like the Bavarianization of German beer. Episode 5, patron question from Anthony Castellano. You misspelled Qingdao as Qingdao. Oh, this is going to bother me forever. I wanted to put the modern spelling. I must have typoed it, or there was a issue putting it in. Yes, it's Qingdao. D-A-O. Qingdao. Not Quingdao. YouTube question. Pabst Blue Ribbon has actually won several awards, just not blue ribbons. They have 5 gold medals for beer. They won the gold medal at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Yeah, this is something I heard back and forth on, that the Blue Ribbon predated the Chicago World's Fair and predated some of the other awards. Either way, this is not a knock on Pabst. I actually super respect it. To me, this is like the most American thing ever. I love it. If it's not true, I'll be a little sad, actually. Pabst was also a major innovator in using cans, not bottles. They were one of the first to mass switch to cans. I do want to really quickly say one thing that we left out that we would have talked about and should have talked about if we had one more episode, was glass technology, and how much commercial bottling plays a huge role in beer becoming a ubiquitous product that you can buy anywhere, right? If you pasteurize a beer and you bottle it under the right conditions, it can just last unrefrigerated on a shelf for months, and that is a huge, huge change. The thing that stops them for a long time is people keep trying to use clear glass bottles, at which point light gets in and ruins the beer. And that's why all beer is brown and green glass now. German brewers in the Civil War, German-style lager was the only type of beer served to the Union Army. They used to wheel huge carts of it through, and this is part of why it becomes so well loved in the U.S. after that. And this, again, was the German Brewers Association kind of getting in with the Lincoln administration, being like, look at our pure German beer that is so delicious with no additives and, you know, very healthy. So like, yes, healthy beer for the troops. And the last thing I just want to say, was Prohibition good, actually? America had a real drinking problem. Like, temperance does not come out of nowhere, right? And a lot of the leaders in temperance movements were women. It was a heavily woman-led movement, and that's partially because, you know, a lot of the violence that was happening due to alcoholism in the home was directed toward women. So they're like, we're not putting up with this anymore. We think that this is not something that needs to be in society. And we are tired of being at the mercy of men that are our primary breadwinner, and, you know, they're spending all their money on drink. They're maybe not showing up to work and not earning money that the family needs to survive, and we're being put at risk. There's also a big African American wing of the temperance movement, and they are right that Americans are drinking too much. It's a huge public health crisis, and one thing about Prohibition is when Prohibition ends, Americans drink about a third of the alcohol that they did before Prohibition. So in some ways, Prohibition is a success in getting the country to have a more healthy relationship with alcohol. I really want to do a Prohibition series. Coming up on Extra History, the Tulip Mania. It's going to be some super wild legend building around economic crises, or maybe not crises. The Ethiopian Empire focusing on the Solomonic dynasty. This is a Christian empire in West Africa that ends up going on crusades and claiming to have the Ark of the Covenant and this really cool backstory. We are actually going to go to 6 episodes on it because it covers 600 years. That's how long they were in power, from 1204 to 1974. And Eleanor of Aquitaine, I'm already writing these. They're so much fun. I've wanted to talk about her for so long, right? She's queen of both France and England at various times. She lives into her 80s. She's the mother of Richard the Lionheart, and just has to hold the Plantagenets together in, just all the dumb men in her life just all go off doing dumb things and messing everything up. It's great. I love her. It's going to be a really fun series. Ibn Battuta side trip, I just want to quickly talk about a beer you've probably not heard of called Knickerbocker beer, which from the turn of the century to about the 1960s was one of the favorite beers in New York. But one of the guys to own it, Jacob Rupert Jr., loved Knickerbocker beer, and he loved baseball. And he wanted a baseball team. He really wanted the New York Giants, who were the team that Knickerbocker sponsored. But by 1912, he finally gave up on them ever selling him the Giants. That was not going to happen. For a while, he toyed with buying the Chicago Cubs. But he's like, Chicago's too far away. So he goes to this franchise that has been imported from Baltimore that is this sad, also-ran, lives in the shadow of the Giants. And in 1915, he buys the New York Yankees, and he uses his Knickerbocker beer fortune to build Yankee Stadium and to import better players and line up good players and managers, including Babe Ruth. And by 1927, they've won a World Series, and they've kind of become the institution they are to get today. So the New York Yankees were built with beer money, while this guy was still sponsoring the Giants with Knickerbocker beer because they were never able to switch that over. So that's another beer legacy in the United States, is the giant franchise that is the New York Yankees. Thanks a lot. Thanks for being with us. I'll see you next time. Cheers.
The most legendary thanks to Ahmed Ziad Turk, Alicia Bramble, Angelo Valenciana, Arcolite Games, Casey Mustia, Dominic Valenciana, Joseph Blame, and Kyle Murgatroyd.